Hello, everyone. This is the trader formerly known as Rob. I'm here with Devin, Matt, and Evan for yet another unexpected podcast. We have what I think is going to be a really fun episode for you today. So, as always, we are going to start with a list review. That is our trademark, and we're going to take a look at 1,000-point Gondor list for Throne of Skulls. And this is where spoilers are going to begin. So, if you have yet to finish Rings of Power, after the list, please tune out until you have, because we are going to talk about the finale for Rings of Power for a little bit, and then do a fun little exercise where we're going to take all of the various armies we've seen on Rings of Power and brainstorm ways that we could bring those to life on the tabletop. So with that, let's get going. Matt, I believe you have an announcement for us.
First, Rob, I think it's necessary for you to explain a little bit more into why you are a horrid and disgusting human being.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you going through a tunnel? You're breaking up a little.
Yeah, Rob, it's right on your screen.
What is?
Yeah.
What is?
Yeah,
I don't see anything.
Next to your name.
No, I don't see anything.
Explain what you've done for the audience, please.
Product placement.
All our Spotify listeners are so confused. They're like, what?
They are. Yes.
So how are you a trader?
Well, unfortunately, I will be betraying the podcast at the next Articon. I have signed up to play with the Wanderers in the Wild for next year. And so I am a traitor to the cause.
Man, I'm gonna ask James if we can all play you individually. Just no matter what
in a row, like a gauntlet.
All 6 games are against the podcast.
You know what, though? I would love that. That would make such a great episode.
Game 3, I played Rob.
Game 4, I played Rob again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Mick would play you twice in dominations.
But let's all remember what's important here, and that's that we're all going to Articon.
There you go.
So speaking of that, just as a public service announcement here, on October 31st, the 4-day Articon tickets go on sale. The 5-day Articon tickets went on sale at the end of September. Given the number of 5-day Articon tickets that have already sold and the way things are trending, it is highly likely that the 4-day Articon ticket sale bundle will sell out the convention. So if you want to go to Articon next year, hop on October 31st, get your tickets. I think everybody on this podcast has already done that. And make sure that you have a spot, because we'd really love to see you there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and just for anyone who clarify, the 4-day and 5-day, if all the 4 days sells out, you can't even buy the 5-day ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, people have had the opportunity to buy 5-day tickets, and presumably if you wanted a 5-day ticket, you already would have bought one. Mm-hmm. But then the 4-day tickets will go on sale. And once, my understanding is if all of the slots are taken by 4-day tickets, nobody gets 3-day tickets. Nobody can buy any more 4-day tickets. Nobody can buy any more 5-day tickets. It's done and it's closed out, and you're out of luck until 2024. So.
Yeah, I think there's a finite amount of total tickets, and it's just tiered when they're releasing, basically.
Yeah, exactly that.
So if everybody had bought 5-day tickets, there wouldn't be any 4 days, but assumedly there might be some. So get on it. Coming up soon.
Yep. Okay. So we ready to talk about a list?
Yeah, let's talk about a list.
So for all those who don't know, just join the podcast, you can actually submit a list on the YouTube channel, or you can probably just, send Rob the Trader a Facebook message. So,
I almost spit out coffee just there. That was good timing. That was so unexpected. Welcome.
along with a bribe, because Rob also accepts those, as we discovered. So, so go ahead and write your list on the back of a $200 check and send it to Rob. And
yes,
you'll get your list
everybody do that. Every listener. I accept.
And for that matter, if you prefer to write your list on the back of a $200 check and send it to me, that's also acceptable.
No take backs. I am point on the $200 checks.
All right, so this is a listener who has a 1,000-point list for Throne of Skulls, and it's an interesting list. It is a Gandalf Boromir list, which is something we've discussed in the past, but haven't talked about in a while. So I'm kind of curious to see how new thoughts and new meta have affected this kind of old staple here. So the list has, as the leader, Gandalf the White on Shadowfax, with 10 warriors of Minas Tirith with spear and shield, 2 rangers of Gondor, I think that's what Raj is, with spear, 1 knight of Minas Tirith with shield. Then we have Boromir. What is it?
He's got the banner. He's got a shield and horse.
Yeah, he's got horse, shield, and banner. It's the White Tower version.
He's got H, sh, and bun.
Right. Yeah. And he's got 12 guard of the Fountain Court with shield, 2 rangers of Gondor with spear, and 1 knight of Minas Tirith. Then we have Ingold, 5 warriors of Minas Tirith with shield, 2 with spear and shield, and 3 rangers of Gondor with spear. Then we have Madril or Madril, depending on your preferred pronunciation, with 6 rangers of Gondor with spear. And that comes out to 46 models, 15 might, and 14 bows. So just some additional thought here. He considered Huron over Madril and Ingold, but lose warband slots. So he'd have to, if he went with that option, get some more knights, just to kind of make figures more expensive. And his other thought is that Huron rule is not as important for allowing basically Huron isn't going to be quite as important because Gandalf's the leader here, which I understand. So with that in mind, thoughts from the panel.
So I guess with a quick disclaimer, Throne of Skulls, for those who don't know, is a tournament out in the UK that is actually known for not being competitive. This is a competitive podcast. We kind of look through everything through that lens. And so as we review this from a competitive standpoint, understand that you probably, for this tournament, don't want to take all of our advice, because the whole point is to bring kind of a fun list that your opponent would enjoy. So, I don't know. I guess maybe that's not the best way to say it, but...
Well, I wouldn't say that it's not competitive at all, but a lot of your score is also determined by favorite army and favorite opponent votes. So it's one of those things where you want to win games because that's still part of the scoring, but on top of it, you want your opponent not to hate you, right? So that you actually get those favorite player votes. So you kind of have to thread the needle between not having complete trash and also not having something that is going to really put off the people playing against you.
I mean, looked at from a theme perspective, I guess it's worth pointing out that this list has Gandalf the White and Boromir, the White Tower Boromir in it at the same time.
Well, that's Madril, so I don't know if we went completely.
Yeah, so this is this has various timeline fails in it from a themey perspective. So unless you're going to go into this and explain to your opponent that this is the Amazon Prime version of the timeline, the theme doesn't work. But I mean, with that said, it's a legal list, and it's a fun legal list to play with. So why don't we kind of engage on what we've got here?
Gandalf the Necromancer, bringing back Boromir and Madril.
Right.
So, all right. Well, then, competitively speaking, trying to review 46 models at 1,000 points. I guess a good amount of them are pretty armored up, so not too big a deal. But I kind of am like, my frame of reference for 1,000 points, I almost feel like, is 46 models kind of average? I almost feel like it
is slightly below. I mean, I always use the rule of thumb of 1 model per 20 points.
Yeah,
so it is slightly below average, but at 1,000 points, it's probably within the noise, especially since you've got 2 pretty expensive and capable hitters in the list in Boromir and Gandalf.
What board size does Throne of Skulls use?
4x6.
Because I know you've been there. 4x6. Oh, okay. So that matters a lot. Because if it were 4x4, I'd say 46 models is perfectly acceptable. Like I think it's even above what is strictly necessary for that sort of game. But if it's 4x6, then I don't think you'd want to go much lower than that.
Yeah,
If anything, you'd want to try and get more models in there. But I really don't know how you do that whilst keeping Gandalf and Boromir in the army.
Yeah. I mean, this is also an army that's going to fight on a ball anyway. This is not an army that's going to be detaching guys to go hither and yon on that 4x6 table.
Yeah, I mean, you want the numbers for two reasons, right? One is to have board coverage for objectives, and the other is to just have enough models to survive to do what you need. And on the second point, you've got Fight 5, you've got D7, and you've got Blinding Light. So 46 is more than enough for point 2. But point 1 could struggle on a 6x4. But like you said, Matt, it's unlikely to split up anyway.
Yeah. So look, I mean, when we're looking over this list, I mean, Gandalf the White is a given, Boromir is a given, because I think the two of them together are kind of the core of this list, and the rest of the list is built around them. So I think we assume they stay in. I think Madril or Madril is a must-have in this list, particularly on a 4x6 board, because what you don't want to end up happening is have end up in one of the Maelstrom of Battle scenarios and get scattered to the four winds on this enormous board where you're never going to come back together. So I think you need Madril. I think you need Boromir. I think you need Gandalf the White. The big question mark here is Ingold, and what gets, basically what gets done with him. I mean, so look, Ingold is one of these figures that I have a hard time justifying putting in a list these days. And I got to say, a large part of it has to do with his special, I don't back up special rule, and how that has been FAQ'd into incomprehensibility. So, I mean, at this point, I cannot honestly tell you, even after reviewing the FAQ, how this rule works. And considering that's kind of his gimmick, and there are other people who do the same stuff he does for a slightly, they kind of fill the same role, it's hard to justify having him here. And so I know various people are going to talk about Huron. I'll let, adding Huron in, I'll let people talk about that. The downside of Huron is he's expensive, so something else needs to come out of the list if you put him in. Another thought I had was to replace Ingold with Irolas, who I believe is the same point cost.
I think he might be 5 cheaper.
Yeah, you're right. He might be 5 cheaper.
But marginally
they're the
cheaper.
Same.
Are they?
They're the same.
They're the same. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, it's the same. And I mean, the advantage of Irolas is I understand what he does. And he brings, I mean, he adds another march to the list on top of Madril. He has 3 might. He also has heroic defense, so he could play the role of the tank, which nobody
so
in this
does
list can
Ingold.
do. Ingold has heroic defense.
Yeah, he's got strike and defense.
Which could be an argument.
You know the model so little that you didn't read the rules. Or
Yeah,
maybe I'm just
so.
completely lying. But last I checked, I think he had both strike and defense.
I will double check. I've got it
Let's
right.
check on that, because I
I mean, maybe he doesn't.
No, he has strike and defense. You're right, and he also has shield wall with natural D7, so he's defense 8 with heroic defense in a pinch.
All right. All right. So Irolas has heroic defense. Irolas has fight 5, and he has march.
Yeah, and Ingold does not have fight 5.
Fight 5.
Well, Madril brings march.
Fight 5 also matters less because you've got the banner.
So but it doesn't affect heroes.
Support him with the fight 4.
Yeah, it doesn't affect heroes. But all right. Well, all right. So maybe Ingold works as well as Irolas, and this list does give you an additional strike. I mean, you can get Kirion in here for 10 points less, and which gives you the strike. You do not have the defense with him, although you do have a guy where you don't have to worry. Well, you at least have to worry less about charging monsters. So that's another thought. But I'll let you guys make the case for Huron. and then we can go from there.
Sounds like your recommendation taking gold out might be due to personal dislike for the profile itself. A lot of like the heroic defense, a lot of what he seems to be trying to do here with this guy is to stall while Boromir does his thing, since Boromir probably is only like a hard hitting. Well, you could argue for Gandalf, but I think for the reasons that you said to bring Earlass, I can understand why he's bringing Ingold. I mean, Rob has more experience with Earlass than I do. I've never even played the guy. I've only played Ingold. Okay, so I guess just to say it, like my understanding of Ingold's rule is they can choose not to back up, but they're trapped if they do that.
Yeah, so
that's like how it's been FAQ.
Here's where it kind of landed, but a lot of this has come down to the dreaded use common sense rule. And basically it's, if he would be trapped naturally, then he's always going to be trapped anyway, irregardless of his rule, right? So like if he was against a wall, for example, if he would be trapped by, say, double pikes behind him, he doesn't have to back up, but he will count as trapped because he would be trapped, right? And if he is able to back up and therefore not trapped normally, he will not count as trapped and not back away, right?
Oh, now I understand. It's all so simple. No,
right. And which, I mean, by the time you've explained that to your opponent, it's already, the end of the round. So, so I completely agree with Matt that I think I love the model. I think it's really cool that the profile exists just from the lore. And I wish that it just never got FAQ'd at all, because the way that it's worded in the book makes perfect sense. And who cares if he can't be trapped, right? Like, how is that breaking the game, right? So, and that's kind of his thing, right? Like, he stands his ground, so he's resolute. He's not going to be trapped because he doesn't back away. But that is not the world we actually live in. That's how it works. It's really only useful to maintain shield wall at this point, right? Or to like make sure your line doesn't back up off of the objective progressively as you lose fights. But wouldn't you rather just win fights with that Fight 5 Boromir banner? So I actually tend to agree with Matt that if you were just going to do a 1-for-1 swap, I'd rather have Irolas, because Irolas is way tougher than you'd think. He has defense, and he has that rule where he can shield with 4 dice at Fight 5. And then even if he wins the fight even while shielding, he can punch the opponent, right? So sometimes it's good to just do where you just throw 4 dice shielding against your standard warrior and knowing you're going to be able to punch them anyway. He brings March, which on the 6x4, having 2 marchers for coverage on top of Madril's Maelstrom protection is really not a bad thing to have, I think. It does add some mobility to the list. And he's got Bodyguard. So if you've got an army that has a lot of big monsters or a lot of terror, the amount of times it's been really useful to have Bodyguard on a character, whether that's Baragond or Irolas, is countless for me. And, there are those times where a Madril is going to fail that courage and doesn't have will left or doesn't have enough, or you have to use his might, and it's just a bad situation. So I don't think that the 1-for-1 swap with Irolas is a bad idea. That said, I don't necessarily think that is the answer writ large, because I definitely remain on Team Hurin for this list, but I'll let somebody else talk now and close my traitorous mouth.
I mean, the Team Hurin, I mean, so I agree about getting Hurin. I'm actually was brainstorming how I would fit him in.
Well, so, I mean, it's only 25 points to upgrade Ingold to Hurin, and if you lose, say, 2 models and then downgrade a handful of Fountain Court down to warriors to make sure that you've got enough spears to,
I think he really wants that
establish
5/5
shield wall. Yeah, but I mean, you can still have like 8 to 10 guards of the Fountain Court with Fight 5 to sprinkle around your battlefield, right? So I don't think you're losing the Fight 5. You've only got 12 to begin with. It's already not covering your whole army. So going down to, say, 10 Fountain Court and then losing a model or 2, I don't think is going to substantially move the needle in terms of your fighting ability, because you've lost a model or 2. If you're at 46, having 44 is almost the same. But what you do gain is a hard-hitting mounted threat, so that you can take Boromir and Hurin and use them as mounted threats that attack your opponent and give them something they have to think about. And then Gandalf can kind of play flex role, right? You don't necessarily want to have Gandalf have to be a combat character, because he's going to be kind of your spellcaster, blinding light caddy, he's going to be fortifying your heroes, and you want him to be a little bit more flexible. And so even though you're not necessarily worried about him dying because he's fairly tough, if he does, you've got Hurin to protect him, but more importantly, you've got 2 regular mounted threats and then potentially 3 if you want to throw Gandalf in, and it gives you more options, in my opinion.
And I guess to support the whole reducing to 10 anyway, it looks like Boromir's warband and Gandalf's warband is actually meant to function like one giant 24 or whatever man warband, because it looks like he's throwing his guard the Fountain Court behind the Warriors of Minas Tirith to bring the fight 5 to their shield wall.
Well, remember the Rangers are also fight 5, and they've got spears, so they're also going to be in that shield wall as well. So you're not really losing fight 5. And I mean, I never thought I'd see the day where I would advocate for losing Fountain Court in favor of literally anything else. But I just think to get Hurin in there, it makes sense.
Yeah,
I think so.
If you really want the fight 5 for slightly cheaper, you can also get Citadel Guard.
That's right; those exist.
On that point of Gandalf and Boromir's warbands are supposed to function together, which I agree that they are. I would advocate, regardless of how you kind of work this out, taking half the guard of the Fountain Court and putting them in Gandalf's warband, and half the Warriors of Minas Tirith and putting them in Boromir's warband.
Yeah.
Probably you can. I mean, if you need to save a few more points here and there, you can probably drop the spears off some of the Warriors of Minas Tirith and just have them, stand in the front.
That's actually what I would have done, because I actually personally I would put the Warriors of Minas Tirith in the front like that. They seem like the front rank to me. I mean, is anyone disagreeing with that?
Well, I mean, the guard of the Fountain Court give you defense 7 regardless of shield wall.
Well, it's not about that. It's just if you lose a Warrior of Minas Tirith, the casualty is not as important, and they are defense 7 regardless.
That's true. But there are certain circumstances, though, I think, where you want to put the guard of the Fountain Court in front, and certain circumstances, just to guarantee you get the fight 7, the defense 7, even after you get pushed back. I mean, you could also, if you wanted to just kind of cheapen this punch up without sacrificing fight 5, is you could have, like half this warband be like a combination of Warriors of Minas Tirith and Guard of the Fountain Court, and then the other half be Warriors of Minas Tirith and Citadel Guard or Rangers on the other side, and that'll save you some points. Keep the fight 5. It's not clear to me you need all of this bodyguard, or at least all of this bodyguard in the form of Guard of the Fountain Court. If you're looking to squeeze Hurin into this list, and I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think Hurin is probably the better option if you can squeeze him in. The only thing that's making me a little nervous is the fact that this is a 6x4 board, and maybe that second march is something that you want on a 6x4 board.
I can say, like, as I was playing those games, like the 6x4 definitely makes an impact, but because most of your opponents also have smaller armies, it tends to get relegated to a 4x4. That's kind of, but I mean, obviously missions like Fog of War or like Domination make this last minute, like, bolt to the other side. So with the really small amount of cav or fast moving units that you have, 2 marches, I think could be a good idea. And I'm pretty sure this Boromir doesn't have March, right?
Definitely does not know.
Yeah. So I almost hesitantly say like that would be a good reason to bring Irolas, but because I think actually it's really important from a competitive standpoint. This army is really relying on Boromir to do a lot of work, and I get it. You got Fortify Spirit on this, but he's doing a ton of it. When you're dealing with 1,000 points, I mean, it's not unexpected to deal with Balrogs and all kinds of crazy stuff mixed in with, all kinds of other big, like, I think 3 threats at 1,000 points is like the standard at this point. Like, and so Hurin is almost necessary in order to bring a lot of I feel like your army does not present that 3rd threat, not even in the units themselves. And so, I hesitate to say, but yeah, I guess I would have to say Hurin, and then maybe try to get a 3rd knight, and maybe that'll allow you to cover an objective on the other side of the field. that's randomly there.
If you guys don't mind me butting in, I think I've found a third threat, and it takes the form of my absolute favorite model in the Minas Tirith list because of how stupid it can be, which is the Avenger Bolt Thrower. And I think
yes.
if you keep Ingold, I think you can fairly easily, instead of changing Ingold into Hurin, just fit in an Avenger Bolt Thrower with the points you have.
The cost of losing how many models?
So Avenger Bolt Thrower is 50 points. You get 3 models off of that originally. So I think you're losing 2 models max, I'd say, and maybe dropping some Fountain Court down to normal warriors. And you get just a ton of board control from that. You've got the 2 marches if you want, or you can just keep Ingold instead of Iralas. And then instead of sending knights over to try and fight over objectives, you can just plonk down an Avenger Bolt Thrower and just machine gun everybody off of the objectives instead. And now instead of you having to go and fight your opponents and wrest objectives from them, you can instead shoot your opponents off of the objectives and sort of bring your opponents to you. Because I don't know about you, but I see no army that's really going to outshoot Gandalf the White plus Max Rangers plus an Avenger Bolt Thrower. And I think especially on a 6x4 board, having as much board control as humanly possible is extremely important.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout.
One other thought, I had taken a variant, well, a Gandalf the White in combination with the Trebuchet, and that's another kind of more expensive, slightly more expensive option.
That almost changes the list a lot, though. Yeah, you're really changing a lot of.
Well, I mean, you could probably sacrifice some rangers and stuff, but you're right. It would kind of change the list itself. The Trebuchet is not as, actually see how expensive it is. It's not as expensive as you might think. No, it's
80 points.
It's 80 points. But it does solve certain things, certain problems for this list, including having the ability to range over the entire 4x6 board. So, I haven't really thought through how necessarily that would work, but it's just it's another option here.
Yeah, I mean, so you either go that route where you put in some siege engines for board control, or you upgrade one of your characters to a third threat so that you have, 3 striking mounted characters pressuring your opponent, or you just completely change the list and go for numbers, right? And you put in like Denethor and just try to get as many numbers as possible. That's really the ways you can go. I wouldn't do that. I think either the Bolt Thrower or Hurin would accomplish what you need, but
probably on Team Hurin mostly. I don't disagree with the Bolt Thrower. I think it's a great idea. But I mean, if you want my vote, that's kind of the route I'm going. I think
it's also more my play style than the Bolt Thrower, so that's the way I would personally go.
I think it's also more his play style too. Like just going off of like what I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
It sounds like he already is considering Hurin. It seems like he has maybe play experience with Hurin. And so my fear is if he throws in a Bolt Thrower, he might misplay it. But I mean, throwing skulls though is the best place to practice. So
that's true. Yeah, that's
try
true.
it out.
Yeah.
So, but obviously theorizing off of a person I've literally never met, don't know. So obviously, great.
Well, and I think that is an important point to bring up too, though, is that all of these things make the list, in my opinion, have more teeth, which could work against you at Throne of Skulls, right? So you have to make that balance, like you said, Devin.
Fortunately, though, you're not playing like the Black Riders, right? Legion or something. So
well, you still might be. You still might be, but that
no. I mean,
probably
like,
isn't. Going.
I mean,
to
like he's
do well.
physically not bringing the Black Riders because you're not winning sportsmanship votes with that.
No. Well, and it's not a lot of scope,
but it's
either, right? So
it is themey.
Yeah.
For anyone going to this tournament, if you're bringing the Black Riders, like you better have a great personality.
Which probably you don't because you're bringing the Black.
Well, and since you also need like favorite army votes, as far as I understand it, you better have like sculpted those ring wraiths yourself, right, out of green stuff.
New poses the whole way. So, but yeah, okay. So I think the takeaway here is you don't have a third threat. You can either go the bolt thrower option, go the Huron option to solve that problem. If you go the Irolas option, you're not really solving the greater issue, but you are indirectly solving the whole, like, you have a 4x6 board. I think simply adding in another knight or two, maybe one, but it would probably fix that issue overwhelmingly. And then they just don't charge your knights into combat. They're simply not meant for that purpose. It's, well, depending on the mission, obviously, but like, you know, their whole goal. And I actually think 3 is a good number for like recon or whatnot, split, you know, all the different directions and whatnot. So that would be, I think, the final thoughts. Hopefully, if I wrap that up pretty nicely.
Yeah, though the knights, they happen to be near Boromir, they're a little better at being a threat than otherwise. So you can throw them in that situation if you need to, but I agree that they're more for playing the scenario. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Nope, I think that's it. So I guess we'll go to the Rings of Power discussion.
So now everybody here, I assume, has watched the finale, or this is going to be, you know, some shocked faces amongst us.
Wasn't this a watch party? I thought we were watching it now. Yeah.
I'm just going to say it now, and then I'll be silent for the rest of the time. Called it.
That they were going to make Halbrand Sauron.
All right, so spoiler alert: Sauron is actually Halbrand, and Halbrand is Sauron. If you didn't watch
although not everybody in the episode realizes this, some to their detriment.
That's right. If you didn't listen to our advice at the beginning of the episode and didn't tune out after the list and have not watched the finale, we're sorry for the spoiler, but we did warn you. Halbrand is Sauron.
So
Halbrand is Sauron.
Since that's obviously the big discussion point, what do we all think of that? Because obviously that's probably the most voted, like, oh, that's probably Sauron. But then it was so obvious and on the nose that it was like, probably not Sauron. So that, and just to say to that point, I'm actually kind of glad they just stuck with it, because I've seen so many shows be like, oh, fuck, they're going to be on to this. And they try to make it some other character that, like, there's no clues dropped, no hints, and it's just like totally out of left field. It's like Nori is Sauron. It's like,
and I think they did it pretty well, because they did not make the characters in the show dumber than the viewers were.
Yeah.
Because at about the time we started to figure out, okay, it has to be him, Galadriel also starts to figure out, oh, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, and figures out that it's him.
Yeah.
And I appreciated that, because, you know, they didn't fall into the trope of making the characters in the show the dumbest people on the screen to not figure out where things were going. They actually got Galadriel to figure it out at roughly the same time.
And in a way that was very organic too. Like it was a way that made sense within the context of the show, that's what would trip her suspicion.
Yeah. And she figured it out, by the way, a lot of the same ways that other people figured it out, which is, she's like, wait a second, how does this guy know as much as he knows about metallurgy, that he's, you know, instructing an elf on, you know, a legendary elf on how to do it. And oh, by the way, wait a minute, now that I think back on it, all of the things that he said to me, you know, if they're true, are add up to a problem.
Yeah. So one thing that well, first of all, I love it. I think that was a great reveal and great on the show. And one thing I appreciated was that throughout the 8 episodes, like I didn't think he was Sauron. Then I really suspected him. Then some stuff happened. I was like, oh, maybe not. Maybe I'm like off base. And then like, boom, it happened. Right. So my moment where I first thought this is definitely Sauron, right, was in a couple episodes back when they're in Numenor and Galadriel goes to visit him and is like, stop being an idiot and being a blacksmith. We have to go. And he's like, why do you want me to go so bad? And they kind of get into an argument, and she ends up telling him that she lost her brother. And he looks at her and he just goes, I'm really sorry about your brother. And to me, that looked like a personal apology, right? Like, I'm sorry I killed your brother, as opposed to any, you know, like, I'm sorry for your loss in a general sense. But then they went to Numenor and he's like all heroic and saving people. And I'm like, did I get that all wrong? Right. So I really appreciate the seesaw.
Yeah. And not only that, but the thing I find really interesting about Sauron and the way they portrayed him is he doesn't he's not like the fully formed villain, right? It's clear that Sauron, like everybody else in this show, is has his conflicts and has his uncertainties. And there was that one scene, I can't remember which episode it was, but it's the one where they're deciding whether or not to send the fleet, where like he throws down the bag, and then decides to come back with it, takes it, and says, "All right, I'll go." And at the time, it's portrayed as his inner conflict is do I stand up for being the king of the South or not? And now when you look back on it, it's clear that what he's thinking is, what is the best path for my success? Do I stay behind and undermine them here, or do I go with this expedition and try and undermine it there?
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. The other thing that I find great about, I don't know the actor who plays Halbrand.
Charlie Vickers, I think.
Charlie Vickers. Yeah. The other thing I find great about his portrayal is, there's this saying that, good villains think they're right, and it's clear in that one, the reveal scene he has with Galadriel, that he thinks he's right, and he can articulate that in a way that's at least internally consistent. It doesn't meet the great villain test. By the way, the great villain test is great villains are right, but so it doesn't meet the great villain test, and I'm not sure you can actually do that with Sauron, but it certainly meets the good villain test.
Well, and a lot of people, I'm sure, are going to be complaining, oh, the lore, this, that, and the other, but I really do like, even if it's in a very condensed fashion and not necessarily at the same points it happens directly in the lore, but Sauron does kind of go through a repentant and unsure of himself phase, right? And so I tried this thing, it failed, there was a mutiny against me, I got killed again, like I'm just gonna give up on this whole taking over Middle Earth thing. It's not even worth it, right? And that's something you can really relate to. It's like, I've tried so hard and I keep failing, like, you know what, I'm just gonna go a different direction entirely, until this elf queen comes along and pushes me to kind of find that fire within myself again. And I read an article, and I don't know what publication it was anymore, maybe Variety or something like that, where the showrunners were talking about, this is obviously post finale, how they were inspired with the character of Sauron by John Milton's Paradise Lost, and how Milton very specifically crafted the character of Satan to be very relatable and very, like, in some ways you agree with him and you're right and you develop a relationship with the character, and that's supposed to actually simulate how easy it is to fall and how we all need redemption because we're all so easily fooled by the great deceiver. And in a way, that's exactly what they did in the show, where you relate to Halbrand and you like him, right? And you root for him in a way. And then when you find out he's Sauron, you're like, well, if I'm asking how these great elf lords could be deceived by this character, I've been deceived by him this whole time, right? And it kind of brings it home. And I thought that was a really interesting take.
Yeah, he is definitely the fallen angel character that both Satan and Sauron were supposed to be.
Which is also very fitting because that's very Tolkien-esque as well, right?
Yeah. And it's good to hear. It's good to hear Sauron, who in all the movies and all the books, frankly, is this kind of mute monolith of evil.
And actually,
actually kind of articulate his position, which we've never had the opportunity to see before, and I think was great fun. I mean, at one point in time, so I have to attribute this saying. So at one point in time, I took a class with Alan Dershowitz, and one thing he told the class was that nobody thinks they're evil. And it doesn't mean they're not evil. It doesn't mean nobody's evil. It's just nobody thinks they're evil, no matter how evil they actually are. And it was great to hear Sauron's articulation of why he doesn't think he's evil.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because actually psychologically your brain does rush to justify everything you're doing and piece things together. But so like I actually really like that the whole so just to make sure I'm fully understanding the scene, did he actually want, so I believe he wanted Galadriel to join him, but did he like put her in a trance at the end of the
He was
episode?
he was inside her head.
Well, he was kind of
Okay.
doing the telepathic thing that that she then actually later does in the Lord of the Rings, right?
No. I mean, the whole sequence where she's when he like kind of teleports her to different locations. Yeah, I believe she's in her head. But
Yeah.
I'm saying at the end when she like gives up the knife and all of that, it almost feels like she's so passive about the whole situation with Sauron. She's just like almost under his control. Like,
oh, interesting. I read that differently.
I don't know. Like, well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know if I read it wrong.
Here's the third take, and I attribute this to Evan, who noticed this when we kind of look into her eyes at the end. Is Evan actually, when we were watching it, goes, "Wait a minute, is she Sauron now?"
Exactly. I thought she was Sauron. So until I saw the scene where he was walking toward Mount Doom, I felt like Galadriel was like in the river. And Sauron had then reformed himself. And I figured that would be logical because they already showed that dark magic can make you reshape into other beings anyway. The servants of Sauron could do it. So it makes sense that we'll get onto them. But I thought that actually Galadriel was Sauron. She seemed so in the trance, oh yeah, this just happened to me, but whatever, let's forge these rings. And just was like she only thought for a moment about that knife. Like, that's not a Galadriel move. Everything we saw in this show, that knife, she protected that thing with her life. Like, didn't matter what situation she was in, whether in an ocean or whatever, that knife had to come with her. And now she's just like, yeah, let's go ahead and throw it in the fire and make some rings. Like, I really thought that was Sauron, but now that I know it's not.
So my take on that is that she views these rings as a weapon against Sauron.
Yeah, me too.
And that is why she's willing to give up the dagger, because she is transforming it into another weapon to use against him.
What makes you feel... Okay, I'm trying to like piece it together because I don't know.
So remember, the knife didn't work. She tried to stab him with the knife and he prevented that. So she knows she needs something else. And that's how I think
she tried to stab him with a knife in her head, right?
Well, no, she tried to stab him in real life. That's how he grabbed her arm and got in her head, because I think touch is integral to doing that. Matt, I completely agree with you. So the way I read that situation was that, the last 2 episodes before the big reveal, after the Mountain of Fire erupted, she kind of had this moment of doubt where she's like, man, I'm just a warmonger. I was all wrong. And like, what am I doing? Blah, blah, blah. And then after the Sauron reveal, and especially when they go back to that line from Finrod, which is, you have to touch the darkness. Sometimes you have to touch the darkness to see the light or whatever. When she came out of that trance he put her in or whatever, I saw it as she's like, Sauron is back. I made him. He's regaining his power, and he's actually real and a threat now. And if we're going to fight him, we're going to need a better weapon. And we're going to need to kind of fight fire with fire, right? And so she didn't go there thinking that her dagger was going to be melted down, because obviously she couldn't know that that's what they would need until she got there. Yeah. But when it came to it, it was kind of like, I know now 100% for sure that Sauron is back and that things are going to get really bad. And not only does that mean we can't leave Middle Earth, that also means we're going to need stronger weapons to fight him with. And if these magical rings are the thing that's going to, 1, keep us here, and 2, give us the power we need to oppose him, then no matter what, it's kind of like the ends justify the means. No matter what, this is the most important thing we can do.
Yeah, this was Galadriel saying game on.
Yeah, this is her being like, I'm going to continue my brother's mission, and his knife is just going to turn into a different form to do that.
Okay, then
that was my reading.
No, well, so I can get with that, and the only doubt I would have about it is, did at any point they see these rings as weapons, like to preserve their ability to stay in Middle Earth? Okay, so they had to be done so that way they could stay to fight Sauron. But did at any point did they say like these are actually like tools for more use than just preservation of our world? This is like a very powerful. They never obviously say weapon, but
they haven't said that yet. But it's not clear to me that they needed to have said that yet. I think there's a whole plot line behind these rings. And by the way, put a pin in this, because where are the other 16 rings?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Which I think were all created at the same time. But I think these rings are going to be the center of an unfolding plot line.
I think that, and I also think that you don't really need to say it, because clearly Sauron was remarkably desperate to get them done and to craft this power of the unseen world over the flesh, quote unquote. And so if he thought they were something that needed to be made, in their mind, obviously they've got some kind of power that he either wants or is afraid of. So I could see how they made that mental leap without actually having to say it, right? As for the other rings, I wonder if they were kind of crafted on screen as they were trying to perfect the recipe for the 3 elven rings, and that's how we'll find out they were made when they kept like blowing up the forge and stuff, or if that will be something that gets done later. That'll be
I think that's got to be something that gets done later.
Well, then actually, to your point to the Galadriel thinking it's a weapon, then maybe she's the one who proposes that, because if they are actually useful tools, and it's like, hey, look, everybody needs these things. So
yeah, and by the way, the decision to make 3 rings was hers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Their rationale behind it being not balanced, but like sort of a checks and balances of a sort.
Yeah, well, I mean, balance, really, yeah.
I mean, her rationale is, one power center breeds corruption, 2 division, and 3 is balance, which, by the way, is true, except if they distribute the rings the way they did in the book, where 2 go to Gil-galad and 1 goes to Galadriel.
but he gives his ring to Círdan pretty fast, right? I think in the book, or does that happen? I think Gil-galad gives one to Círdan.
To him.
Yeah.
Well, I think when he dies, he gives it to Elrond. He gives the other ring, but I think he gives it to Círdan before. I'd have to double check.
Yeah, I think he does.
But I agree with you, Matt, that the thought is there, but the execution was clearly not.
So I think what's probably going to happen on screen is that Gil-galad is going to get 1, Elrond is going to get 1, and Galadriel is going to get the 3rd.
They'll probably just.
I actually think that Celebrimbor instead of Elrond is going to get 1, and then spoiler alert, he dies in the lore. And then before like Eregion falls, he sends the other one back to Gil-galad, and Gil-galad gives it to Círdan.
How does he die in the lore again?
He gets killed by Sauron. Yeah, he gets killed by Sauron, who's looking for the rings, but he's given the rings to other elves for safekeeping.
And so I think it's going to be one of those. He knows that the end is coming, so he sends the ring away to Gil-galad and Lindon, who gives it to Círdan, who we know was cast for season 2. He dies gruesomely, and then Sauron uses him as a banner. He crucifies him to a banner and carries him in front of the army. So we'll see if they actually show something like that in the show. But
that'll be
a brutal turn of events. The show is already showing it. It can go to that graphic detail, we saw burning bodies and such. So
yeah,
and the wargs.
So on the subject of people who guessed wrong, I don't think anybody can say that they guessed wrong worse than the 3 witches.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, right. That's like a pretty big misfire.
That's right. That may go on record as the worst airport greeting ever.
So, all right, I just want to this has been bothering me. One of we'll call them witches. We're calling them witches. That's what they are.
Yeah, well we're calling them witches because
wizards.
Because Mick called them the 3 witches.
Okay, so we'll go with witches.
They have names, by the way.
They do.
Okay. They have names that I guess you can figure out by pausing the screen and seeing who the actors are playing. And
it's the ascetic, dweller, and nomad, right?
That's correct. Yeah, the ascetic is the caster. The nomad is kind of like the Hashiran type guy with the throwing knife, or type woman with the throwing knives, and then it's not at all clear to me what the dweller does.
Mm-hmm. So they have a staff with an eye on it. From my understanding, the whole idea of the eye wasn't a thing until Sauron died.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was. Let me actually see if I can find a picture of that.
It's not like he rallied behind banners of an eye. It was like, if I remember right, maybe I'm wrong, Rob, you can correct me on this, but in the books, the eye is watching the great eye. One, it wasn't actually an eye, but it was more like a propaganda to say he's always there, he's always watching, so keep working, keep doing your thing.
So I pulled up a picture of the staff. I mean, I think that it looks like the Eye of Sauron specifically because we are almost trained to see the Eye of Sauron, but functionally it's not specifically an eye, right?
But wouldn't
could you pop that on screen just so we can see it?
I feel like the props department would have known that it looks very close to the
let me
tower.
Since you're already doing screen share, let me send it to you here real quick.
Well, no, you have the capability to screen share. You can pop it up.
I don't, because my computer blocks it, unfortunately. But here you go.
Well, that's an unhelpful thing for your computer to do.
I know.
Yeah. But yeah, that was one thing that I was kind of like, if I'm right and it's an eye, I'm like, how?
I think that it is an eye, but it's an eye because we want it to be an eye because we know what Sauron becomes. Whereas if you look at it, it could also be a sun. It could also be like a moon, right? It could be a lot of things.
True. All right.
But I agree that it's a clear visual cue for the viewer to link them to Sauron in our minds, right?
Well, then I guess going on that point, so it's confirmed he's Gandalf, right? Like the guy,
Well,
the stranger.
It's not confirmed, but he certainly is talking like Gandalf.
Yeah, he's sounding.
I think it's all but confirmed, personally.
Yeah.
So
there's this one line where he talks about like following your nose at the end of the first episode, which is like straight out of Gandalf's lexicon.
Well, it's word for word, in fact, right? From the movie to the show, except that they change Meriadoc Brandybuck for Eleanor Brandyfoot, which is itself not much of a change.
All right, so here's the staff, by the way, and so so this is I-esque, but the thing in the center could quite easily be
it could be all kinds of different things.
It could be a moon or a sun or whatever.
Or just like a disc, right?
It could be a disc. You know, you're right, Rob. Actually seeing
and especially because we know that they're from Rune. Rune geographically is, Tolkien's Asia, land of the rising sun. Like it could be the way Easterlings have sun motifs, right? It could just be a sun.
Okay. No, I think you're right. Seeing it up close like this, okay, it's not very obviously an eye.
But I think it's cleverly done to also be an eye in such a way that we who know the movies and the lore will associate it with Sauron.
Yeah,
right?
It's definitely eye adjacent. But if you actually look at her clothing, by the way, you'll see the predominance of circles in the design of her clothing. And those are not kind of eye aesthetic circles.
Yeah, it seems to be more of just a motif of their design. Like
exactly.
Can we actually take a second to just acknowledge how awesome the design of the three witches were, though? Like they look so cool, don't they? Like generally.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I certainly like them. I think the Hashirin one, as you mentioned it, was a little well, I guess here they come from Rune. Yeah, the Nomad. She's a little too like on the nose of like a Hashirin. I think the rest of them that I like their design aesthetic. It was only that one that like her little head garb that she had like.
Well, it kind of looked like a Phrygian cap to kind of represent the whole East, right?
Yeah. But I mean, if they're coming from Rune and that is basically, as you said, Tolkien's Asia, then it's fitting. Yeah. So,
the Rune kind of represents, Asia, the Middle East, the East in general, right? So all of those various Persian, Chinese, all those influences all kind of wrapped in one, right?
I definitely like their whole look. I think I like the way that they portrayed their magic. It felt very much like the fact that they needed to find a source of fire before they could just breathe fire all over the place. We've seen that before. Her moving Gandalf around, reminiscent of Saruman and Gandalf's fights. We've seen that before. So like the magic seemed pretty similar to what we've already seen before. So I'm glad that they weren't like doing anything crazy new. So the transforming, so being able to appear as someone else, that's something I'm so glad they brought in, because I was kind of like annoyed that never happened in the book. Because like Saruman and Gandalf and all of them can do that. And they never show that at all, that they can
and what's interesting, by the way, is there appear to be limitations on that power in that the aesthetic has to touch a person first before she can assume their shape.
Yeah.
She touches Nori, and then she can become Nori. And then she touches Proto Gandalf, and then she can become him.
Proto Gandalf. I like it.
Then okay, that's good. I mean, the fact that it does have a limitation allows them to not get caught up in scenarios where it's like, why didn't she just transform? And
that's right. Why can't you just transform into a bat and flap away?
Exactly. So hopefully that is the restriction behind it.
And I kind of hope that this isn't the last we see of them, even though they at least nominally meet a fairly gruesome end, which I love that they kind of almost looked like Twilight ring wraiths when Gandalf revealed what they really look like. I really wonder what's going to happen with that.
They definitely do appear to be, we're talking about proto Gandalf. These guys definitely appear to be proto wraiths.
I was desperately looking at their hands to see if I saw any rings, if like the rings of men were already forged off screen and these were ring wraiths or something. But
I'm kind of glad that wasn't the case.
Yeah,
I am glad that wasn't the case. And also, I don't think they're bad. I think he banished them, and they come back just like all the other spirits do. So
yeah, I think you're right. I hope so. I'd love to see more of them. So,
oh yeah, and that'll be
and Gandalf. How does everybody feel about that? I know this is probably going to be pretty controversial for people.
Well, I guess for me, it was kind of like it was so obvious it was Gandalf that the only reason I didn't believe it was Gandalf was just because
because it was so obvious.
Yeah, like so I was kind of like, well, I mean, this is the reason he loves hobbits, and like, so
well,
I mean,
the other reason not to believe it is because he's not supposed to be there during that time period. He's an age early.
The show is very clearly position itself where it's like the timeline. I think, and honestly, it's probably a smart move anyway, because they have to age the actors incredibly for all the human characters. It would just be a mess, and you'd have new actors. I mean, well, I don't know, House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones thing is doing it. So, like...
well, and I would say that obviously the Gandalf of the Lord of the Rings arrives in the Third Age, but Olorin, who is Gandalf, right? He's been in Middle Earth many times from the beginning of time, essentially. Like he would walk among the elves before they went to Valinor. And since they've written so little about the Second Age, or Tolkien wrote so little, there's nothing saying he couldn't have come, and then died or something, then sent back to Valinor, and then resent as a wizard in the Third Age, right? So it's not necessarily anti-lore, even if it's not like 100% lore adherent as we know.
And apparently the blue wizards were present in the Second Age.
Well, Tolkien actually wrote like 2 or 3 different versions of that. In one of them, they came in the Third Age with Gandalf, basically, or right before. One of them, they came in the Second Age, and I don't even remember the third one. Basically, he never settled on that, and so when his son was compiling, the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, the histories of Middle Earth, he kind of picked one, right? And he'd be like, "Oh, based on my dad's notes, this is what I have decided to make, quote unquote, canon," even though all of those are theoretically non-canon. The only thing canon, quote unquote, would be the main books that Tolkien published himself. But so, I mean, there's a lot of scope there where it could be one way, it could be the other way. And so I think it's kind of silly to try and be 100% adherent to anything in the Unfinished Tales or the Silmarillion, because it's all kind of, mutable.
Even Peter Jackson wasn't totally faithful.
Oh, he wasn't faithful at all in a lot of ways, right? So
I mean, Jesus, the whole we could go on and on about the differences there, but I'm like, that's one thing, like, for anyone who's upset about the show because it's not following faithfully the book, I'm like, well, none of them do. Like, this is not new at all. Like, this
right? Like, tell me about that scene in Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring where Glorfindel takes Frodo to Rivendell, right? Like, he wasn't adherent either. So
yeah, Pelennor Fields, like the whole undead scene.
I mean, Helm's Deep.
Helm's, the
elves at Helm's Deep. I mean, yeah, I agree.
Cave Troll and Moria, like, yeah.
So I actually really, even though it was obvious, I guess it still could not be, but assuming that it is Gandalf, I think that's a good choice, because as a viewer, like, I don't have a relationship with the Blue Wizards. I don't care about the Blue Wizards. I don't know about the Blue Wizards. So having a character I know and care about assume kind of the role of what the Blue Wizards did, right? Go to the East and sow discord, gives me as a viewer a emotional entry point to care about the character, and ties it to the wider, legendarium that I love. And it simply just gives the role of the Blue Wizards to a character I already like, not unlike the way Peter Jackson put, several characters' roles condensed into somebody else, for example, right? So for me, I like it because it's like, oh, I care about Gandalf. I want to see a young Gandalf. This is something that I enjoy.
Young,
right? Exactly.
Well, you know what? There isn't. It's possible also we could still see the Blue Wizards, and that this is just an introduction to the wizards falling to Earth. Now we see how that kind of interaction happens. Potentially we could see more. In fact, I wouldn't even rule it out that in future seasons you might see all 5. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about.
Well, and one interesting thing, and this could happen later, is that in at least one version of the way Tolkien wrote about the Blue Wizards, they actually went to the east and turned evil and started magical cults. So they could you could easily have sent Gandalf, quote unquote, and he's clearly headed to the east. His whole thing is I need to get to Rune, right? Because the previous wizards turned evil in the east, and he's there to like combat them or something, right? And I mean the cultists could very well have been sent and taught magic by the blue wizards who had turned evil in the east. So there's no saying that we don't actually encounter more wizards as well, in a way that might be very interesting to have like a proto Gandalf v Saruman kind of showdown.
Yeah. Except not two wizards, so he's kind of screwed.
Yeah,
but yeah, no, I mean everything about that to me. I guess once again, I just have to commend the show is not trying to pull a fast one and subvert expectations by giving all these clues that it's this character, but it's not, and it's just like, well, now it doesn't make any sense. Like, and the thing is, even like the Sauron example, some certain things can be brought into context. Like, why wasn't Sauron eaten by the worm? You know, the giant, you know, he's the only one who survives. Like, right. Well, yeah, now it makes more sense, right? Like, so, well,
and obviously, Matt, you brought this up on a previous episode, but his remarkably difficult shattering man's arm. Right? Like, you have to be quite strong to do that. So,
but see, now I appreciate that they stuck to it, because I'm like, otherwise that doesn't make any sense anymore. Like, a lot of stuff Halbrand did doesn't make any sense if you don't make him Sauron. And so I'm like, good, you just stuck to it. Everyone was guessing it, like a lot of people, but they're just like, yep, this is exactly what it is.
Well, and now when I do a rewatch, and I inevitably will do a rewatch, I'm going to see it in a completely different light with that being confirmed, right? I'm very excited about that. So,
and I also thought I said this before, I'll say it again. I thought they did the arc very well, as far as taking it to the point of, like creating an inkling of suspicion, building the suspicion, going back on the suspicion, and then taking it to the point where you figure it out at roughly the same time. For certain, at roughly the same time the characters do.
Yeah, I do think it was, they attempted a clever writing of declaring the old man as Sauron, so that way it would throw the viewers off. They're like, all right, well, Halbrand can't be Sauron because now this is Sauron. But
I mean, obviously, you're all thinking that can't be right.
Yeah, that can't be right. Exactly. They tried a clever writing.
I watched it with my wife, and my wife isn't, nearly as much of a nerd into this as I am. And when that happened, she turned to me on the couch. She's like, "What?" Right? I'm like, "No, relax. It's gonna be fine." But
So I mean, I thought that reveal was great. I guess not much else was really revealed in the episode other than the king dies. King of Numenor is dead now.
Tar Palantir.
Yeah, and
well, that was actually kind of interesting as a scene to see sowing the seeds of Ar-Pharazôn, like looking at the king dying and talking about how men cannot achieve immortality, because if you know anything about the lore, he eventually becomes so afraid of dying and wants to achieve immortality. That's why he invades Valinor, right? Yeah. Spoiler alert, but this has been around for 60 years. Read the book.
Well, he never even makes it on the shore, right?
Yeah.
Like,
he makes it. So he makes it on the shore, but he gets like trapped in a cave for all eternity or something like that. It's weird. Okay. But the point is, like, sowing the seeds of Ar-Pharazôn's fall, because before now he's just kind of been a politician who hates elves, right? But seeing that kind of glint in his eye, and the way the character played that genuine emotion of fear of death and desire for immortality, which, by the way, just as a side note, the acting was outstanding, right? Like, we're talking about Charlie Vickers as Sauron. The way he switched from Halbrand to Sauron on a moment's notice, and it was just a different character. Like, kudos to how well that was acted. Like, visually, it was no longer Halbrand in a split second, and I didn't think a person could do that with acting, so good job. But the same thing with Ar-Pharazôn switching from, I'm just the Chancellor who's, power hungry, sure, but turning into Pharazôn the Counselor, into the future Ar-Pharazôn the Morgoth cultist in that moment was very cool.
Now, just to bring clarity to it, the king told the girl to touch the Palantir. Why was he having her do that again? I know he thought she was someone else or something.
He thought it was his daughter. He was having his, hallucinating as he's old and sick and losing his mind.
I mean, I assume what's going to happen there is that she's going to see the destruction of Numenor, and then what's unclear to me is kind of what she's going to do with that, because she could take it to Al-Farazan, and Al-Farazan could, take it, interpret it completely the wrong way. Or she could take it to her dad, and they realize what Al-Farazan's going to do, and that's when they take the fleet and break off. I don't know which way it's going to go.
So yeah, I agree. I think that it's really hard to guess what they're going to do with the character. Either she is going to be the architect that builds like Minas Tirith, right? Or she's going to be the architect that builds the Temple to Morgoth on Numenor, because she becomes Farazan's number 2. And it could go either way.
All right, well, I guess with the time that we have left, unless there's anything else about the show, I know Rob, you proposed an idea of maybe those who want to try to create armies.
Yeah. So if anybody has any thoughts on the show or wants to hear more about it, just put it in the comments. We could certainly discuss more in later episodes. But since we're also excited about Rings of Power, clearly we've all watched this show with great interest. Many of us are, as hobbyists and gamers, looking at that and thinking, well, what if I want to play with these Rings of Power characters and armies on the tabletop? Unfortunately, we have no idea if and when that is going to happen officially, with Games Workshop getting the license and putting out rules and miniatures. It could be soon, it could be a long time away, or it could be never, for all we know, right? So in the meantime, all we have is the profiles that we have now. And so if we were to want to channel that passion for this material into something that we could represent on the tabletop, how would we do that? So why don't we take a second and talk about that? Roughly, I would say there are broadly 3 armies that you could do. I'm not going to count like the elves, because you just play the elves, right?
Yeah,
but
that's kind of
or like the Harfoots just play hobbits, right? Like there's not a whole lot of stretching to do there. But the 3 main buckets I can identify for armies that would work differently based on Rings of Power than they would in the game that we already play would be the Orcs, the Southlanders, and the Numenorians. So I have some ideas for those, and I'm sure you do too. So why don't we start by
one little asterisk, maybe we can talk a bit at the end, is the 3 witches.
Oh yeah, and the 3 witches. Good call. I didn't even think of them, but I think that's a great idea. So why don't we just pick one? Does anybody have a particular preference for which of the 3 buckets we do first?
Go ahead.
I was like, maybe the Southlanders, because that seems to me to be a little bit of the easiest one to represent in the game.
I thought Orcs was the easiest one, but
yeah. Well, if you want to do Orcs first, let's do Orcs first.
Oh no, I was saying I wasn't saying which way should go first. I was just like, it's term of easy. Well, I mean, the Orcs
are Orcs, yeah.
Yeah. But no, let's go with Southlanders.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right,
well, I guess you already had a thought on that one.
Well, I can go first, or if somebody else wants to give their thoughts first on how they would represent the Southlanders.
So go first, Rob. Lead in.
All right. So for me, this actually seemed like it would be pretty easy. Obviously, and for all of these armies, it would be pretty hobby intensive, because you'd have to convert the aesthetic for the various new characters. But the Southlanders, for me, seem pretty easy. Devin, before we started the podcast, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting that we'll pick up on, is that you can kind of represent them as both good or evil. So on the good side, for me, what I would do is you would make it a small army, because it was a fairly small village of Southlanders, and you would have Lake Town militia that you would use to represent the actual Southlander army themselves. And roughly what I would do is I would have Hilda Bianca, right, to represent Bronwyn. I would take Bard's son to represent Theo, right? And then just like a captain, a Lake Town militia captain to represent, I don't actually know the name anymore, but the other kind of like village leader that ended up getting killed in the battle. And those are your main characters. And then you fill out their war bands with Lake Town militia, with a mixture of spears and bows and etc. And then you plop in Legolas to represent Arondir, right? And once you do that, once you have Legolas with his bow, Hilda, Bronwyn, Theo, and the Elder with full warbands, it's about a 400-point army. So if you're kind of doing a small skirmish to represent, you know, this tiny little village defending itself against overwhelming odds because they were quite heavily outnumbered. That would be the way that I would probably do that. I think Arondir is an amazing character, and I think he's awesome. And so I might try to take my hand at converting him myself. I believe it becomes a Green Alliance, right? Because Halls of Thranduil and Lake Town Militia are green together. Which doesn't really matter because you're not taking Bard. Though, if you wanted to go to higher points, you could take Bard and call him Halbrand, King of the Southlands, because we know that's not who he is, but the villagers seemed pretty motivated by the idea. So that would be the way I would do the defense of Tir Harad. Would be Lake Town Militia plus Legolas.
So I would modify that. I wonder, because the one leading them, it's just, you know, throwing out thought ideas here, but the one leading them is the elf, it seems. What's his name again?
Arondir.
It seems like he's the one who's kind of like I understand completely that Halbrand is certainly who they rally behind as far as the king, but in the actual like battle, if you were to represent it before he actually shows up, I think it's Arondir who's kind of leading them, right? Like, I would kind of wonder if, and I know he has a man profile, but like if you use Bard, but like, you know, with his 3 bow shots, it's kind of elf-like. It's, you know, so I'm kind of almost wondering if maybe that profile, certainly not the look of Bard, obviously, right? But the profile could suit Arondir just before Halbrand arrives. Like if you were just trying to,
I like that take.
Yeah, I don't hate that. Yeah, I don't hate that at all. I think that's pretty cool.
So obviously you wouldn't have any daughters or whatnot. But
well, I mean, here's the thing: like you could have the daughters to give him the extra fight and the extra oomph to make him more elf-like, right?
Or one daughter, and that's Bronwyn.
So you could do one as Bronwyn, but the other
you could do the other one as Theo.
Well, no, actually, I wouldn't do the other one as Theo. I would use Bran as Theo.
Yeah, that's who I would use as Theo. Nominally, but if you wanted to use both daughters, you could do Bronwyn.
What I'm saying
Theo,
is
right?
that Bran interacts with Bard the way that Theo interacts with Arondir. Like Theo, I think respects him. So I'm like, it kind of even adds that little extra effect where, like, you know, the best part is you wouldn't even have to change Brand all that much. They kind of look alike, right? As far as the figure sculpt, like, but
no, you actually wouldn't have to change him at all. You just paint him with like dark hair, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe cut off his sword a little and paint it black, but
or make the sword fiery or something like that.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
So I guess what I would have done with Arondir.
I like that idea. That's cool.
I like that idea too. So the one kind of downside to this, or the one, I guess, you know, kind of fly in the ointment here, is the fact that the survivors of Lighttown have armor. And these guys didn't. And I think the way to model that is you just don't buy any of them shields.
Yeah,
because they didn't have shields, and I
just
think
spears and bows.
Yeah, spears and bows. I think that's right.
That's probably. I mean, I think. No, I was thinking of any man profile. Yeah, you're probably right. You couldn't get around the armor issue. You just have to do shields and bows. Did they? Oh yeah, they did have bows. Yeah, they had bows on the roof.
Yeah, so they had archers for sure.
To be fair, I mean, people are always complaining about how the survivors of Lake Town don't look like they have armor anyways. So I think this is pretty much a 1-to-1 conversion.
Matt was not talking about the profile. You said, I'm sorry, he wasn't talking about the aesthetics, because theoretically you're going to model them all off the movie anyway. What he's saying is
I'm not talking about the aesthetics either. I'm just saying that if you argue that survivors of Lake Town have armor, then you can argue that these guys also have armor.
They have as much armor on as the Southlanders do, right? Yeah, I agree. Those are some really thick jackets. I guess it gets cold in Mordor, right?
Well, what you need to do is you would need to insert the scene that they do have in the Hobbit movies where they're going into like the armory of the elf stronghold and like pulling out the old chainmail and putting it on and stuff like that. Either that, or you could just say that it's, you know, their armor is their intense will to live.
You know, this is if you actually had time to sculpt all this before Throne of Skulls, this would be a really cool army.
Oh, it's such a
really
it's
really neat.
Definitely beyond my skill, so I'll never do that, but somebody out there can.
So those are 2 ideas, I guess, on how to make the Southlanders, at least on the good side. I had mentioned to Rob that the evil side has Southlanders, and now they are armored up, and they're armored as orcs, which makes so I threw out an idea of ruffians, and
which I think is awesome.
In theory, it was like, at first I'm like, oh, ruffians, that sounds great. And you even have some of the leaders that you could use to, like, you wouldn't obviously use Shark, you'd use the guy who sets woods on fire.
Yeah, so I actually think that the better take on this are the wild men.
And that's why I was like wondering, because I'm like, one, they had armor, they had orc armor. So wild men don't have armor either.
Wild men don't have armor either, but they have whatever the wild men leader is in the Dunlin list.
Yeah.
That kind of subs in for the old Oathmaker that kind of subs in for the whatever the dude's name is, Walder, I think his name is.
Waldrag.
Waldrag, yeah, who takes the sword.
Which actually works on many levels because he is literally an Oathmaker, right? Like he's the one who makes the oath for the Southlanders to Adar. So
right.
So the only reason the wild men are actually trained in combat and it reflects it in their fight 3. The ruffians are fight 2, I believe. Now, obviously, the Hobbit rule doesn't make any sense with them, but that would be why I think I would lean more toward ruffians, is because these guys should probably be worse in combat than the orcs they're fighting with. They're like literally the cannon fodder that you sort of throw around. So it's weird to think of an orc as an elite troop, but in
on
the
army,
they're an elite troop.
So, but on the other hand, I mean, some of this comes out in the wash, right? I mean, you could just say that the higher fight value is, which they probably shouldn't have, is the counter. It's the substitute for the armor that they don't have. Right.
They shouldn't have fight 3, but they do. I agree. They shouldn't have the same fight value as like Gondorians. But I mean, I'm just kind of like
on the idea of ruffians, though, there's also heroes on the ruffian side that are good to represent some of the traders, right? Like the guy who sets buildings on fire.
Rowan,
that was the whole thing where they're
that's true.
They're setting the village on fire, so you could have any one of those ruffian heroes also represent Waldrag. So I think you could go both ways and it could work, honestly.
No, I'm right, Rob. All right, this is a road now.
So on the orc side, a couple of interesting thoughts here. One way to do this, right, would be to have armor escalation all the way across the board. So, well, no, I guess that wouldn't work. Forget that thought. I'm going to throw it out. But on the orc side, one interesting kind of take. One thing I noticed is that very few of the orcs carried shields. Although some did, because at one point, Arendir picks up a discarded orc shield, and uses it. So I think probably you don't want to have a lot of your orcs carrying shields. It also strikes me that some of these orcs are probably Morannon-like. And then they're definitely orc heroes involved, like the big guy that fights Arondir in the final battle, who I think is probably Goroth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the best list that this could work with would be Gothmog's Legion, is what I was thinking. And you can sub in Adar as Gothmog, because from what I've seen, Adar doesn't seem like a particularly he seems like a decent fighter, but not like elven hero levels of fighting. So fight 5 is probably a good value for him. And the Gothmog special rules as well, I think, would translate quite nicely into the fact that he's inspiring the orcs and whatnot and giving them buffs. And like Dad said, I think Goroth would be another include in there for the massive orc.
I think that's a good take. I mean, obviously, if you did the Legion, you'd have trouble integrating, kind of either the Wildmen or Ruffian solution. Although maybe what you do is you just say that the humans are regular orcs and the orcs are Morannon orcs.
Doesn't Gothmog have built into his profile the whole hating men thing, or is that all Legion rules?
So Gothmog has it built in, and the Legion expands it, right?
Yeah. So I mean, you could choose to not use the Legion, and you still get kind of those effects.
Yeah. Interesting.
Master Tactician, arguably, I don't know the Gothmog just charge right into a tower.
The other candidate would be like a Black Numenorian. What's the black? Whoever the Black Numenorian captain is.
Sure, it's way too armored though. You're talking about defense 7.
Yeah, but we never. we never actually see we never actually see. Does he come with a shield? We never actually see what Adar's.
I mean, Adar was captured.
He's got a
battle.
sword and no shield, but he does have armor on.
Yeah.
I mean, you're definitely looking at someone who's more like 5'5". So Gothmog with no shield would fit that. So I'm still.
That's true.
Well, he is an old elf, so.
And yeah, I mean, like everything about even Gothmog's movements would translate well with that. But obviously, don't bring a warg. So. Trying to think of any other hero in the evil side that would represent that. So honestly, Gothmog might be just one of the best picks.
Yeah.
So,
and honestly, 3 attacks probably fits Adar better than Gothmog anyway. So
yeah, that's probably true.
Well, I had a bit of a different take on that one. Well, if you would.
Well, go ahead. I think that was just the first idea.
Yeah. So when I looked at the orcs, they seemed like they were like stronger. They could hit the broadside of a barn with a bow, and they were kind of like lightly armored but fastish.
They almost felt like super strength when you first meet them.
Yeah. So my thought was actually to represent the Southlander orcs. Adar's army was actually hunter orcs. And the way that I would do it was this. I would take a Dark Powers of Dol Guldur alliance with Hunter Orcs. And on the Dark Powers side, I'd take the Witch King version of the Dol Guldur Nazgul to be Adar. I would take Thrain the Broken to represent Waldreg. And I would take the Keeper of the Dungeons to represent like the big orc, right? The one that's like bashing everyone. And then just Hunter Orcs. And then I would ally in either just generic Hunter Orc captains, or if you wanted to, you could theoretically take like a Fimbul or someone and have Hunter Orcs. So that way, the ones that have bows actually shoot better, right? Because they're got the better bow shooting. And the orcs themselves are lightly armored, have no shields, but are a lot punchier and have like a lot of march because they seem like they're pretty fast. So I think I would probably do, that's what I would probably do to represent the orcs. And I feel like Adar fits the Nazgul profile because
except for the
resurrection.
Boing, I'm back up. Oh, yeah. Boing, I'm back up.
Except that every time you think in the show that he's dead, he pops up again, right? Like he's very slippery. So it represents like him getting out of situations. But without the necromancer in there, it's not a very reliable one.
What about Fimbul for that role? Because Fimbul is fight 5. Is he?
Does Fimbul have the option to be taken off his warg?
He does, yeah. I think, right?
My almost heroes.
Fimbul though also has like weird special rules that like Adar probably wouldn't. Well, actually,
no,
I feel
like it avoids terrain like an elf.
Yeah.
Well, so Fimbul is, yeah, I think he would be good. He could also work as the.
What's the special where we can charge across terrain? Or
no, he's got the fell sight from his. Well, that's from his warg, isn't it? Yeah, he's got move through terrain thing.
You could also just buy a warg for him, and then just model it as a horse, right?
Yeah, you could.
He's on a horse.
That is true. Yeah, you could just do that.
I mean, okay,
and then the warg passes its courage test, and you've got a horse running around. And
it's a feisty horse.
You can just tell it.
I like the idea of the Nazgul having like terror and harbinger because they're clearly terrified of Adar.
Was he terrifying Adar?
Have you seen that guy? That worked for me. He's got the whole like I've got armor and a sword and a gauntlet, and that's kind of what I do. And Fimbul I could see as the one orc that ends up getting murdered by a Rondir that's looking for the blade, the Jed Brophy orc. That's kind of leading them before he gets killed.
Oh, I think that's Yazneg because he's the guy that dies early.
I guess you couldn't make that Yazneg for that reason.
How do you represent that one like berserker orc that Arondir fought for like a good? Was that a special type of orc or was that like? I couldn't tell if that was just a bigger orc than normal.
I think Keeper of the Dungeons, but any of the beefy orcs would work, right?
Yeah, Keeper of the Dungeons, I think is the right call on that. Mm-hmm. So the only problem with this is the Hunter Orc to attack thing, which I don't think accurately represents the orcs, because 2 attacks at strength 4, I think is going to buzz through the southern list more than it really should. That's I mean I thought about the hunter orcs, and where I stumbled was the two attacks. You know, although, you know, one thing you could do if you're going with this kind of Dol themed list is the orcs could be the Gundabad orcs without shields.
You could just make them Gundabats without shields. That works.
Gundabats do work,
And then it functionally accomplishes the exact same purpose, just changes the orcs from a little more punchy to a little bit tougher, right?
Yeah.
Which, you know,
I like that.
How you get the Southerners in there, though? I'm not. Yeah, the Southerners.
You have to do an impossible alliance, and then just that'd be the only way to really do it. Which, you know, they don't need their army bonus anyway. Master Battle and Azog, you're not bringing him. So,
I mean, that was one of the reasons I was actually thinking for the orcs, Moranans without shield.
Moranans without shield was the direction I was thinking, and it would give you a lot easier access to the orc heroes that would better represent Adar, in my opinion, anyway. But
the only issue with the Moranans is like they don't have that sort of heavy armor. Like the armor we see on the orcs.
If you just take away the shields, you're still defense 5.
Yeah, that's also why I was thinking about kind of armor escalation.
Yeah.
You know, if you know, 4s or 5s, and what would ordinarily be a 3 to 4.
Didn't we just like talk about how like they don't have shields? So I mean, why would they be that defense then?
Well, no, my point is, like, look, if we're using the survivors of Lake Town who are defense 4 to be the ordinary villagers who want to be defense 3 or conceivably even defense 2, then I don't have a problem taking the orcs and having them be base defense 5 even without a shield.
Defense 2 is reserved for like feeble old men.
Yeah.
Or like little girls.
Yeah, right. So you know, if defense 3 in this particular world is actually defense 4, then I don't have a problem with, you know, the defense 4 ordinary orcs being defense 5 for purposes of this kind of matched pair of lists.
You know, that just gave me an idea, though, for if you're going to do the Dol Guldur based approach, you could ally in goblin mercenaries as your humans. And so they're weedier and they kind of pop up in front of the army.
Yeah, I guess that's not bad.
And they can represent the weedy villagers that are sent ahead of the orcs to be slaughtered.
That actually works for the whole Gundabad argument. Yeah, I like that. I mean, Turin Hordes doesn't make quite too much sense, but you could give them spears and say, like, that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, they're armored as orcs, but armed just like the other Southerners broadly are, right? So having them have spears and whatever, I think is a small quibble. But then you have a very clear profile distinction between crappy humans and good orcs.
Yeah. No, I like that. That was a good thought. So I guess for sake of time, we'll move to the Numenorians. And does anyone have a throw-out idea? Because to them, they seem almost obvious.
Well, are they?
I've got like 3 different buckets I think I would approach it with. So why doesn't somebody start?
Well, okay, so let me put the finger on the problem. And that is that there is no, if they're Numenorians, they ought to be strength 4, and there is no strength 4 cavalry on the good side. In a certain way, the best profile
there is, but not one that represents them well. Sons of Eorl, right?
Sons of Eorl. Yeah, that's for certain reasons not what we want. But to a certain extent, what represents them the best is
Dunlending Horsemen.
Dunlending Horsemen.
Yeah, I figured that's where you're going. Actually, you know what? If you ignore the fact that they're evil, honestly, like, it barely matters, right? Like, you don't have archers, so because I don't think any of the Numenorians brought archers in the battle. So I don't think it's a bad shout, except the lack of spears. Did the Numenorian Cav have spears?
They did.
They had lances, or spears, but lances.
I mean, I would almost go all mounted Minas Tirith.
Well, he wants to strength 4. So the obvious route is to go all
it isn't clear to me that Numenorians in this show are actually strength 4.
That's fair.
You're right. For the show's purposes, Numenorians are no different than anyone
I
else.
agree with
And,
Evan. Like, I see
yeah.
this as like early Numenorians. On the show, they clearly haven't gone anywhere to fight in a while. Most of them were like village volunteers, right, from the
Yeah.
public square. And so the Numenorians we see in the Last Alliance that are hardened troops that survived the fall of their island and have been fighting against Sauron for 7 straight years are not really the Numenorians that we're seeing in the Rings of Power. And I would say the same thing goes for their heroes. So like the Elendil of the show is not the Elendil of the,
No, he is
modern
not.
profile, right?
Yeah,
I think
you're right.
Hurin makes a great Elendil in this situation.
Evan, I think me and you
especially
are on
because-
exactly the same wavelength.
Yeah,
because
that's
he
actually-
protects
Yeah.
he protects the king, the
Mhm.
queen rather.
Yeah, so
who I think makes a decent Denethor, although I mean you have the screwy rule that Denethor comes with that obviously she has no parallel with, but I mean, you know,
We have to have her mounted.
it happens. Well, yeah, but she doesn't actually fight, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you could have her mounted, or you could just say, she's on it. I mean, the reason to make her Denethor is like you were saying, give Elendil the kind of the Huron
Protection thing.
role, and also the fact to portray that she's just basically going to stand in the back and bring bodies.
That's true. And I guess that is the best route you can go. I mean, yeah, she won't be on a horse.
I mean, or you just do the obvious route and take a queen of men on a horse, right?
Yeah.
That's
true. Yeah, you could
Yeah.
just.
That's
literally-
fair.
And I
to
mean,
be fair, I think it would have a better fight profile than she would probably have.
obviously the king is Denethor though, right? So like if you want to take a island of Numenor army,
Yeah, but
then
he
you
doesn't go
take
out to
him as
battle with
Denethor.
them.
Well, yes, but
Model him in a bed.
if you
Yeah.
alternatively, if you
Yeah.
don't take the sort of horse thing and you want to take a on the island Numenor army, then the king can be Denethor.
Mhm.
And I think that's much more fitting than taking the queen as Denethor, which makes, in my opinion, no sense whatsoever.
Mhm.
Well, they're trying to get
So
the rules for it. That's all they're trying to do.
yeah. I think Isildur, and his friends or whatever, I think a good shout for either maybe Isildur or his friends would be Baragond.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, Isildur sucks at
Yeah, he's
fighting.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
terrible.
Yeah. So he's fighting. His fighting isn't great, but it's very clearly pointed out that like he's brave because he's like bracing to get into the fight, and
Yeah, I
so
think
the
Baragond's a
bodyguard
good
works
shout.
really well there, right? Where he's not really particularly potent, but like he can't wait to get in. He's not afraid.
You just can't fire his bow. That's all.
Yep.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah, no, Baragond's a good shout.
I like that a lot. So this
So
is
by the way, I do like the queen of men on a horse, but doesn't that create restrictions?
let's find out.
I don't think it'll
What do you
create
mean by
restrictions.
restrictions?
Like if you take the king of men, you can't take like any
Yeah.
other named hero or something
Well,
like that.
No, I don't think that's.
No, you lose your army bonus. You lose your army bonus
Alright,
if you
so
take
maybe we
other
don't-
named heroes, I'm fairly
Maybe
sure.
maybe we don't.
Arguably, you don't need. I mean,
Kings of Men
Yeah.
may not be included in any army that contains any other named Gondor heroes. Yeah, so that's a
Yeah.
problem.
All right.
Oh, it's
I
an
mean-
automatic restriction. Okay.
Yeah.
Then
You-
can't do that.
You could just go with a captain then, right? Or
No,
you could even
because
make her like Faramir or
I
something.
think
if you wanted.
Huron is a hero of fortitude or valor.
He's
Well, plus
valid.
you do
So
want
you
the
need
whole-
a valor hero because Huron
Yeah.
then will protect them.
Yeah, well, and you do need somebody who. I mean, you want the queen to actually be the leader of the army, right?
Mhm.
Well, that's
I
why I'm
mean,
saying you need
yeah.
a hero of you can't use
I mean,
captain.
that's what led me to Denethor,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of weirdness that comes at it, but that makes her like this is the piece you need to defend.
I mean,
you
the
know
other
what? This
option,
is the time where
and
she's blind, and so when Denethor walks around, it's because she doesn't know where she's going.
Yeah.
She thinks she's fighting the enemy. She's like,
Yeah, that's Yeah, she's blind and she's just like drawing her sword and hacking around wildly.
Yeah.
I mean, the other option, I think, for one, maximum competitiveness, and two, you can sort of see it as well, would be Boromir with the banner, and sort of using him in more like a supportive role, because
Mhm.
obviously everybody's inspired by the Queen.
But six
and
months.
she-
You'd have to restrain the hell
Well,
out of
I
yourself to
mean-
not use the fight six and
So
Yeah,
I
I
see
mean,
where
she
you're
doesn't-
coming
comes and
from.
bites her and she kicks his
She
ass.
also doesn't fight though, so we don't know whether she's a good fighter or
She's this
not.
huge
So
badass that doesn't fight to make it
theoretically,
fair for the
yeah.
enemy.
Yeah, she's just
Yeah,
like,
she sits
whoa.
back to make it fair.
Yeah.
You surround her and she's like suddenly pulling out 3 attacks and fights 6.
I don't hate it. The only problem, at least with the army that I kind of was writing for this, is that I think that Boromir, Fellowship Boromir allied in would make an awesome Halbrand.
I could go with that better than
No, because of the will. So I was thinking about this. I think Halbrand is Aragorn, Fellowship Aragorn.
I guess that makes sense too, because the whole thing is like he's very mighty, right? So I was looking at Boromir with the lots of might and the no fate, because he clearly, gets hurt at the end. And specifically the fact that he couldn't lead anyone, right? That he's kind of on his own. But Aragorn also fits that very well as well.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I think he got hurt because he wanted to get hurt.
Oh yeah, I mean, we know that was clearly a deception, right? But
that's right.
But it fits what he's playing at in character kind of thing.
Yeah.
yeah.
And by the way, and Galadriel is Glorfindel.
100% Glorfindel. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. And in fact, that would be, so the army that I was looking at would have Hurin, Glorfindel, Fellowship Boromir, all Knights of Minas Tirith. I had a Queen of Men in there because I forgot about the restriction, but you could replace it with Denethor. Or
honestly,
whatever, right?
honestly, you don't even need to take the queen, because as we were talking about, she doesn't fight. So if you want to just go with the fight, you can take Hurin, Aragorn, and Glorfindel.
And then Baragond if you wanted for Isildur as well.
The only problem is you couldn't make Halbrand the leader. Because like Hurin wants to protect.
Well, arguably, I'd say Galadriel's the leader of the army anyway, right? Like the queen
actually,
is
that's probably better,
but she's the one actually leading them in battle. So I would say Glorfindel is your leader, which also works really well competitively, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got your army of Knights of Minas Tirith, and I mean, if you want to be really adherent to the aesthetic, you don't take shields for them, just the lances, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got, you're probably going to need more characters just to get more bodies in there, so maybe you take Captain to represent Valandil, because he was like his lieutenant, right? So you take and then you have Boromir or Aragorn for Halbrand, and that's your army. And I think that would actually be really cool.
Baragond is Isildur as well, I think. And then that gives you 6 more.
So Hurin, Captain Baragond, Aragorn / Boromir, someone to represent Halbrand, and Glorfindel plus all knights. And I think that would actually be a really cool army. I kind of want to try that anyway, right? Like just to see how it plays. But
you're playing all knights, so it'll play
like all knights.
like an all.
But I think it could be a fun little army, and especially if you get Aragorn in there for his, because you're frequently putting him in with Rivendell knights. So these are like crappier knights, but same concept, right? So I don't know. It could be kind of fun.
As a final thought, and this is just curious, is like to get the fight 4. Because Númenóreans, maybe they're not better fighters. Maybe in the show they're not. So I was thinking about the Citadel Guard mounted, and then just give them all spears.
Yeah. Well, they are fearless, right, in the show. So having them would be bodyguarded as well isn't a bad shout. I actually think, though, if you really want to be a stickler for the fight 4, the other bucket option for this would be just to take Rohan, right, and have be like.
Well, you'd have to do, because I was thinking about
all Royal Guard.
Well, either Royal Guard, or you do. This is where you could do like Eorl as Elendil and Sons of Eorl as the troops. The only problem is with the 2 attacks. Without the 2 attacks, they become uncompetitively. If you use some different hero, they become uncompetitively expensive. With the 2 attacks, I think they get to be a little too powerful. And I think the idea that this is basically kind of an army of volunteers as opposed to professional trained knights actually lends itself better to the fight 3 in Minas Tirith.
Actually, that's a good shout. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think if I was to go the Rohan route, I'd honestly just go with Theoden as the queen and keep him like relatively no shield, maybe no armor, sitting in the back.
You make Eowyn the queen.
You could do Eowyn, and then I wanted her to buff the army, right? So, and then you take Éomer as Elendil. basically, or Darewine if you want to represent the kind of protection aspect. But I actually think the Minas Tirith does lend itself better to it because they have the lances, right? And they're volunteers.
Can we talk the three witches for a second?
Absolutely.
Well, as a quick thing, I unfortunately will have to go. but yeah, no. So
God, and they call me the traitor.
I know. I'm sorry. I actually had a meeting right at this time, so I had to go. But yeah.
Why don't you drop off, Devin? Thanks for joining us. We will very quickly discuss the three witches and then sign off.
Sounds good. See you, Devin.
All right. So my take on the three witches were the aesthetic. I think obviously is Kardouche.
Mm-hmm.
The nomad is a Hashuran.
Mm-hmm.
The nomad is the one with the throwing knives, and so the dweller. It's kind of hard to understand what she does, except she seems to be the one that's in charge, at least in certain scenes. And I said Dalamir.
Okay, interesting.
So that was my take on the three.
Huh. I have to admit that I didn't even think of the three witches, but that's a really interesting take. Could you do her instead of Dalamir as like Musger or something, where she just like stands back? But I guess she doesn't really fight, right?
She doesn't. So one, she blends into the background a lot. She's the one who tends to like disappear, and you don't know where she is or what she's doing.
Yeah.
Two, she doesn't use magic. It's only the ascetic who seems to use magic.
Mm-hmm.
And three, I think there's enough scenes in there that one could intuit that she is in charge.
No, I agree with the in charge part. She definitely seems to be giving everyone orders, right?
Yeah.
It just seems weird because Dalamir is a Hashuran. They're just the same. You're just taking the same thing twice, and Hashurans do the exact same thing that he does, really. So I feel like we want one Hashuran in there, I'd say.
Well, so what about the name is escaping me, but the guy with the whip that gives rerolls? So he like stands back and gives the other two rerolls.
The Taskmaster?
No, the Corsair character. Delgamar?
Delgamar?
Delgamar.
Yeah, but no whip. I don't know. It's hard to kind of put a figure for the dweller because we don't know kind of what she does yet. But I mean, at least I think at least the idea that she's like the Hashuran that's like in charge, is at least defensible.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of an evil model that sits in the back and just like hands out buffs. And because I hadn't given this any advanced thought, I'm coming up dry right now. But
yeah.
But that's an interesting thought. I like that.
I mean, especially if you wanted to have like a little armor based on these three, you'd need to have the dweller be able to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, and the other thing is, are you going to be putting them in another army, in which case they can kind of stand back and do their own thing? Or is this going to be your army, in which case you want like a functional all-hero list, right? Even at small points, exactly. But
who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows at this point? This is all, I mean, the other problem with all of this, of course, is that none of these three can be banished. But, perhaps they're their own characters, but I just wanted to kind of come up with some way to kind of talk about all three.
I wonder if you could do this with Easterlings and have Brorgir be the wizard.
Yeah, but it's and the wrong spells.
Yeah, I guess because Tremor doesn't really. Well, what if she was Brorgir, and because like it's all about buffing other people to do better? What if that was the aesthetic or whatever her name is? I'm just trying to make the rune.
The aesthetic is the Flame Burst character.
Yeah, so you definitely want Kardouche for that, just because Flame Burst fits that perfectly, right?
Right.
I think for the fighty one could be a Hasharin, or you could theoretically just have a fighty character, right? So maybe like a Dragon Knight, for example, from the Easterlings, and then you could have Brorgir be the leader or something like that, maybe.
Maybe. So I mean, the throwing weapons are very much the nomads thing.
Yeah, I mean that's all she did, right? So
yeah. All right. Well, anyway, these are just thoughts. We'll just have to see how this kind of develops.
Yeah, I like it though. That's good. I like that.
All right, guys. Thanks. It's been fun.
Thank you. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. So give us a comment on what your thoughts might be on how to represent the Rings of Power, or what you thought about the episode, and keep sending in those lists.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.